Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day. Welcome to part 3 of my new video tutorial series helping users transition from the FZ200 to the new FZ330. In part 1 we looked at the autofocus mode, and in part 2 we looked at the manual focus mode, and in particular we learned how to set the autofocus area to the single size, single area method that we're used to with the FZ200 by pressing the side control focus button. We learned how to program the function 4 key to allow us to set area size and position using the top control dial and the navigation keys. Just refreshing on that, when we press the function 4 key once we've programmed it, gives us access to changing the position of the autofocus target, and if we use the top control dial we can increment the size of the target in large steps, and if we use the side focus wheel we can change those increments in finer steps. So between the side and the top control dial we should be able to set the position we really want for that focus point. Once you've got it set where you need it, press menu set and then you can take the picture. We learned how to set up manual focus by turning the back control switch to the manual focus position, and then that gave us access to manual focus using the side control wheel, and we can now finally set the focus point to exactly where we need it. We also learned how to set up focus peaking to enable us to see exactly what are going to be the sharpest points of the picture. We also learned the facility of setting the whole screen to be the enlarged area, or we could have the enlarged picture-in-picture size in the center of the screen. I prefer to use this feature where I bring up the whole of the screen to be the point that I can check for focus rather than the picture-in-picture. In today's video I want to look at the metering modes. They are exactly the same as the FZ200 in as much that we have the whole area, center weighted and spot metering. With subjects like the one I've got on screen at the moment, this white polar bear against the dark grey background, it's likely to influence the way the metering circuit works, particularly in something like spot metering. If I switch the camera to spot metering, and again we do that by stepping into the record setup menu, and you'll find that on page 2, select spot metering from the menu and then come back into the main shooting screen. Now the way the spot metering works is by taking the area underneath that little cyan cross, and to enable us to set the position that we want to measure from, we go into the autofocus area set method much the same way as you would if you wanted to find the focus point. So again, by using our F4 key we can change the position of where the camera is going to meter from, and I find it much easier if I reduce the size of the target to the very smallest area, and that will give me a representation of where the camera is going to be metering from. As you can see, as I'm moving the focus target, which includes the exposure meter target, to the dark background, it causes the camera to overexpose. If I bring it onto the whiter areas, so it's now trying to set the exposure to neutral grey for the white areas, it forces the background to be dark. If I go into a shadow area, it probably gets the exposure a little bit better, and that's the method I normally use for shooting things like the moon, where we pick a crater which is sort of average tone density with spot metering, and that prevents you getting the highlights blown out. So it's important to recognise what the subject type is and which type of metering to support. For something like this you probably want whole area because you're going to take into consideration the background and the subject. At the moment in spot metering and metering from the shadows, the camera is calculating a 15th of a second at f3.5, and I'll just take that picture for reference. Now if I go into the whole area metering, which is the top one with a spot in the middle, and set, now come back to the main shooting screen, it's now evaluating from the whole screen, including the central area of the polar bear, and it's calculated that to be 1/20th of a second, so we'll take a reference shot of that. Quite quickly you'll learn the type of subjects that affect the metering mode. So here we have a white subject against the dark background, and the camera is likely to underexpose this sort of scene. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of exposure compensation, and that is held on the function 1 key. So pressing the function 1 key brings up the exposure value compensation. and I'm going to dial in something like 1/3 or 2/3 of a stop of extra exposure to compensate for the fact that the camera is going to underexpose this situation. We can have a look at that in the edit, and you'll probably see we've got a lot more detail in the white, and it's a white rather than a mid-grey, which the camera has tried to drive this subject to. If I now set up the camera for center weighted metering, it means more of that image in the center of the screen, which is the white predominant area, is going to influence the camera even more. So let's just return the exposure back to normal. We'll go into metering mode and select central weighted area. You can see the camera has now determined an exposure of a 1/25th of a second, which is going to underexpose that image. So what we need to do is to add exposure value compensation to make that white appear white rather than mid-grey that the camera has tried to drive it to. So again, using the function 1 key, I'm going to put in 2/3 of a stop exposure value compensation, and we'll take that picture for reference. Let's look at some of the camera aids which will help us to identify whether the scene is correctly exposed or not. With the FZ200 we had the highlight warning, which would allow the image to flash black and white for any areas that have been overexposed. We have that facility in the FZ330, but there's an even better method. If I set up for the same method of highlight warning that we had with the FZ200, I'll find that in the custom setup screen, and it's called highlight, and I've got that set to on. So if I take an exposure, at the moment there's no highlights being shown as being overexposed. If I deliberately put some exposure value compensation into the exposure, say +1, when I take that picture, so on the image, areas of white that have approached 255 on the scale have now got no detail in them at all. So the highlights are what are called clipped, and there's no detail there whatsoever. So we want to try and avoid that. But this is after the event, so we've had to take the picture to find out which parts of the image are actually overexposed. But with the FZ330, there's a much smarter method called zebra zone, which shows you what's going to be overexposed before you take the picture. Let's have a look at that now. The zebra pattern is in the same screen. It's on page 5 of 9 of the custom setup. The first thing you need to do is to set the two thresholds for the zebra pattern markings. So if we first of all turn this on, we need to go into the set mode. And we've got zebra pattern 1 or zebra pattern 2, and you can choose whether you want zebra pattern 1 or pattern 2. They're just different thresholds. So for example, here at the moment I've got the zebra zone 1 set to 80%. It means that anything above 80% on the scale of 0 to 255 will be indicated by the zebra 1 crosshatch. And if I've selected zebra 2, then it means that anything above 95% on a scale of 0 to 255 again will be indicated. Now we've set the thresholds, and something like 80 and 95% are ideals. If I wanted to look at just the highlights, particularly for this polar bear, I want to see anything over 95%, which is going to be considered as overexposed, as I want to maintain the highlights on this. So having set the thresholds, we can come back to the menu, and I'm going to select zebra 2, which is the 95%. So when we now go back into the shooting menu, you can see the images displaying those areas which are 95% towards total saturation of 255. So it's up to me now to remove that zebra zone pattern by reducing the amount of exposure, and in this case we're going to be using exposure value compensation as we're in the semi-automatic mode. So by pressing the function 1 key, I can reduce that overexposure that I've got built in now with a +1 EV to something like +2/3. Then I need to press the shutter again to re-evaluate it, because you can't unfortunately do a live preview of the zebra pattern. It would be really nice to be able to preview in a live view mode, but unfortunately you have to make your change and then evaluate the scene. So there's no zebra zoning with a exposure of a 25th of a second at f3.5. So the zebra pattern function is an ideal tool now to show you what's going to be overexposed in your image before you take the shot, so you're going to be aware of anything that's going to be clipped in terms of the white highlights. There are some situations that are going to be beyond the dynamic range of the camera, and no matter how much you dial the EV back to remove the zebra zone, you're not going to be able to capture the shadows and highlights which that scene probably possesses. With the FZ200, we're used to using the slide switch on the side of the lens barrel to change between autofocus and autofocus macro mode. With the FZ330, it's a button again on the side, but then that couples into the side control wheel to enable you to change whether you want autofocus or autofocus macro. It's the same with the FZ330 as it was with the FZ200. When you're in the autofocus mode, the focus range is from 2 meters to infinity if you're using the full telephoto, and if you switch to AF macro, that reduces the range from 1 meter to infinity. By using the AF mode button on the side of the camera, I've got the option of setting macro mode on or macro mode off. So I've got the macro mode set to on, which allows the camera to focus from 1 meter to infinity. If I use the navigation key or I use the side control wheel, I can move from one position to the other. If I set it to off, the focus range is going to be 2 meters to infinity. The one in the center is the macro zoom, again uses zoom, digital zoom to give you the macro zoom facility, so I just wouldn't bother with that. You'll get much more pixelated images. So either use the AF macro and the close-up lens to get a larger image. On the screen you can see the mode we've selected, which is the autofocus macro mode, because we've got the little flower symbol. You might also notice on the screen that I'm using the electronic shutter, so that tells you we're at electronic shutter. It's the E mark over the shutter button. And if you wanted to use electronic shutter, that's set up in the setup menu. And you'll find that on page 5, so you can choose between the manual shutter, the electronic shutter, or let the camera decide which is the best for the exposure you're taking. There is a silent mode, and that is in the custom setup. And the silent mode turns off all the sounds of the camera. The silent mode is useful in a situation where you can't have the camera make a noise during the exposure. So for example, if you're using the 2-second timer, you don't want it beeping as it counts down. You want to turn off the focus aid, which is the beep when it's focused. And you want to turn off the shutter sound when you take the picture. So with the silent mode on, if I take this picture, all I get is a picture being taken, no sound whatsoever. So that's useful if you're in a museum or a theatre where you just don't want any sound to be emitted by the camera during your exposure taking. Of course, one of the other methods you have of determining whether your exposure is correct is to look at it in the playback mode. You select playback by pressing the green arrow key on the back of the camera, and by using the display button you can cycle through the screens which show you the image information. One press takes us up to the area that shows us the aperture and the shutter speed, exposure value compensation, which white balance we've set, and the ISO we used, the type of focus method, and other information like we've used the extended option for intelligent resolution. We've used aperture priority, we've used the standard photo style with some adjustment, we've got the 16:9 aspect ratio, fine JPEG, and we're in the Adobe RGB color space. If I press the display button once again, it now gives us a histogram, and you notice the histogram has changed with the FZ330 in as much now that we've got the color channels. We've got red, green, blue, and luminance. So if a scene has got a lot of red in it, you would have more red than green and blue on the histogram. So it's a useful method of checking saturations for particular colors as to whether they're biased in the histogram scale. So that's red, green, blue, and luminance. Luminance is just the brightness of the scene. And you want the distribution of the histogram to be between the shadows, which are going to be over on the left hand side, and the highlights, which are going to be over on the right hand side. So those are some features which enable you to get better exposure with the FZ330. They were in existence on the FZ200, but you probably didn't use them. I'm just bringing them to your attention now so you can get better control of your focus and your exposure. So until the next one, thanks for watching. If you're a new viewer to the channel and you're following the series, please do click that subscribe button and you'll be notified in your subscription list when I upload any new videos in this series. Of course, follow my photographic blog and there'll be a link to that in the video description below. And if you sign up to the fortnightly newsletter, there's lots more information that I put out again on FZ200, FZ300 and the travel zoom cameras from Panasonic. So until the next video, thanks again for watching, please do take care and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.